Good morning and welcome to Sunday School this last Sunday in January. Can you believe it? The last Sunday in January. We're just clicking right away at winter time, and before you know it, spring's going to be knocking on our doors, and it won't come one day too soon for me. Our lesson for today is Session 9 in the Quarterly, or if you're following in your Bible, Chapter 3 in the book of Daniel. From last week, you might remember that Daniel and his three friends were exiled into Babylon. But they weren't the typical exiles. These three were supposed to be trained for 3 years and hopefully indoctrinated into the Babylonian culture. Well, at least that was what King Nebuchadnezzar was hoping for, and that's what he was expecting. However, he didn't realize the resolve of these young men to remain loyal to their God. They chose not to eat the king's menu, but ended up outshining the other exiles who did. And also, their keen intellect put the king's own court magicians to shame. And then added to that, Daniel was also blessed with the ability to interpret visions and dreams, which turned out to be very useful in the future. Chapter 2 of Daniel accounts a time such as that when Nebuchadnezzar had a dream that troubled him. And he called in all of his magicians and wise men to interpret the dream. But he also wanted them to recount the dream for him because he couldn't remember it. He just knew that it was a dream that troubled him. And of course, they couldn't do that. They just kept saying, well, if you tell us what you dreamed, we can tell you what it means. But he became so angry that he ordered all of the wise men to be executed, including Daniel, who had proven to be wise at his interview with the king. Now, Daniel went for help to his friends, and together they prayed for mercy from God that Daniel would be able to fulfill the king's demands. So it's very important that when we have prayer requests that we share that with our friends or with people that we know are going to pray with us and for us. So God answered their prayers. During a vision in the night, God revealed to Daniel all that he needed in order to narrate the king's dream and to interpret it for him. And Daniel, of course, gave God credit for his ability to know this and to express everything that he told the king. And in verse 47 of chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar seemed to have a change of heart regarding Daniel's God. In that scripture, he said, "Surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery." He placed Daniel in a high royal court position in charge of all the wise men. And at Daniel's request, he made Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego administrators out over the province of Babylon. Now, even with what Daniel was able to do with the help of his God and the God of Israel, and even with the statement that was made by Nebuchadnezzar regarding Daniel's God, the king and the Babylonians still worshiped many gods. In fact, he even established a large golden image out on one of the plains of Babylon and commanded his leaders to fall down and worship this golden image when they heard the sound of some specific musical instruments. If they did not follow the king's command, then they would be facing death by fire. Because of their positions, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego lived away from the royal court, out on the plains, out in the area of Babylon, and it was reported to Nebuchadnezzar that they did not fall down and worship that image as he had commanded. Nebuchadnezzar was furious over this report, and he called for the three Hebrew men to appear before him. And that brings us to the first scriptures for today's lesson, which is chapter 3, verses 14 through 15. Nebuchadnezzar spake and said unto them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Do not ye serve my gods, nor worship the golden image which I have set up?" Now, if ye be ready, that at what time you hear the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, the psaltery, and the dulcimer, and all kinds of music. Now, that was a signal that he had indicated when everyone would fall down and worship. Ye fall down and worship the image which I have made. Well, but if ye worship not, ye shall be cast in the same hour into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands? It appears the king was in somewhat a state of belief when he called them by their Babylonian names. When he said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, is it true? Really, he didn't want to believe that it was true. These bright men had proven quite useful to him, and he must have had a hard time believing that anyone would actually choose to defy a royal command that brought with it a consequence of death. Now, he would actually like to keep these around for a while in his service. So in asking them, Nebuchadnezzar was probably hoping that it was just all a mistake and that they would deny it and say, no, that was, the report was wrong. And in fact, he gave them an opportunity, if it was true, that they could rectify this situation by reminding them of the rules of the command and the penalty for disobeying it. If they hadn't been so useful to him, they probably would have died right on the spot. Now, the Babylonians worshiped many gods, and Nebuchadnezzar didn't care if they worshiped their God. But not bowing to his golden image constituted a public disobedience to his decree, and that was a serious matter. It appeared that he was willing to overlook if they had disobeyed out on the plain. But if they were ready now, he was going to give them a chance to erase that mistake and make everything right. So he reminded them again, at the sound of the musical instruments, you can fall down and worship the image, but he also reminded them of the consequences, that if they did not, a furnace was burning and it was ready for the outcome of disobedience. Excuse me. Nebuchadnezzar asked a rhetorical question. Who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands? Now, he knew that he was the most powerful man on earth at that time, and he believed that there was no God who could save them or anyone else from him. And his strategy may have been to frighten them into submission. And he didn't really expect them to answer his question, but he got an answer, and it was far from any that he would have expected anyone to respond. And especially if they were facing his rage, because it was well known that he could be very furious. And their response was given in verses 16 through 18. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. If it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. They had made up their minds to demonstrate total allegiance to the Lord regardless of the cost. They didn't doubt God's ability to deliver them, but they did realize that God does not always choose miraculous intervention on behalf of his people. And they were fully aware of the situation they were in, but they also knew the law of Moses prohibited the worship of any other gods. And for that reason, they could not obey the king's command. Now, we know the outcome of the situation because we have it written for us, but keep in mind, they didn't know at that time how God was going to respond. Yet they held fast to their faith, and they put their total trust completely in God and felt at peace with whatever the results were. You know that peace that's spoken of in the Bible, the peace that surpasses all understanding. Now, their response didn't sit too well with Nebuchadnezzar, as we see in the next scriptures, which will be verses 19 through 23. Then was Nebuchadnezzar full of fury, and the form of his visage was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He was kind of willing to overlook this mistake. It was a mistake. He was going to overlook that and give them a second chance, but now he was furious. Therefore he spake and commanded that they should heat the furnace 7 times more than it was wont to be heated. And he commanded the most mighty men that were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their coats, their hosen, and their hats, and their other garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Therefore, because the king's commandment was urgent, and the furnace exceeding hot, the flame of the fire slew those men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down, bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Nebuchadnezzar was not used to anyone defying his commands, so he was in a rage that words could hardly explain. And he gave orders to heat the furnace as hot as it could possibly be heated, 7 times hotter, knowing that it would strike fear in anyone watching the transactions, or standing around watching what was going on and listening to the conversation between the king and these 3 Hebrew men. Smelting furnaces were shaped somewhat like an inverted milk bottle. There was a large opening at the top, and there was a smaller ground level where the fire burned. But there were 2 or 3 holes punched into the ground level where they could insert pipes for large bellows that could be used to raise the temperature inside the furnace. So the fire that was waiting for these 3 men was not just a trash pile. It was hot. It was designed to produce extreme heat. And the king ordered the 3 to be tied up, fully dressed, including their head coverings. And of course, the fabric was flammable, and it would assure that the fire would quickly and completely consume. It would engulf their bodies and consume their bodies, which may have been the reasoning for having them tied up in their clothes. Or it could have been that the king was so livid, he wanted the process to be done quickly to impress any bystanders that it would not be a good thing to even consider denying or disobeying any of his current commands or any of his future commands. Nebuchadnezzar was totally enraged, and he wasted no time in throwing these 3 in the fire. And it was such a rush situation that the soldiers who physically bound the Hebrews and put them in the fire didn't take time to protect themselves from the heat, and they actually lost their lives because of the extreme heat. Nebuchadnezzar thought he had covered all the bases in making sure that these prisoners had no way to escape. They were bound, and they were thrown immediately into this blazing furnace. The structure allowed a person to look in from a side opening and see the men in the furnace. In taking out his anger on the Hebrews, he actually lost some of his best soldiers when they got too close to the flames. But then in the last scriptures, we'll see what happened next, and that would be verses 24 through 26. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astonished, and rose up in haste, and spake, and said unto his counselors, Did not we cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered and said unto the king, True, O king. He answered and said, Lo, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the mouth of the burning fiery furnace, and spake and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, ye servants of the Most High God, come forth and come hither. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came forth of the midst of the fire. When Nebuchadnezzar looked, he suddenly jumped in a startled alarm. Maybe he thought that his eyes were playing tricks on him, because he asked one of his advisors, had they not thrown 3 men in the flames? And the answer, of course, was yes. 3 were bound and thrown in. And he checked and double checked this fact with several counselors on hand, because what he was seeing was 4 men. They were not bound. They were walking around in the fire, and they were not burning. The 4th man, even Nebuchadnezzar recognized as a divine being. Maybe it was an angel, or maybe it was Christ pre-incarnate, but it definitely was a miracle that even the king of Babylon recognized, the mighty greatest king, or the mighty greatest man on earth at that time. So he quickly changed his attitude, and he called those 3 Hebrew men by name, by their Babylonian names, and told them to come out of the furnace. And these 3 were determined to stand for God, regardless of what it would cost them. The gods worshipped by the Babylonians had fallen short once again, and even Nebuchadnezzar realized and recognized that these men were servants of a most high God, and they were not at his mercy and at his power. In our modern world, in some countries, Christians still face persecution, imprisonment, or death for their faith in God. Aren't we lucky that we can go and attend church and worship God without fear of imprisonment and persecution and death? But in our everyday lives, we face sometimes rejection by friends or maybe even family members because of our faith. We also may face severe challenges in our personal lives that might cause us to question our allegiance to God and to his word. But the words in the Bible say that God will never forsake his children. And when we have no guarantee of an outcome that we desire, we have to be more like these 3 men in the fire and put our total trust in God. To that faithful God that we owe the highest love, reverence, and obedience, as well as our gratitude for his faithful presence in our lives. We might need every morning, every day, to make a new pledge every morning to live that one day in allegiance to him. We can only live one day at a time, but we can pledge just that one day. Let us have total allegiance to God, come what may. And at the end of that one day, we still may need to ask once again for his mercy and his grace and his forgiveness for falling short of total trust and allegiance in him. We are all so humanly imperfect, but we are not alone in our fires or on our mountains or in our valleys of life. I want to thank you for joining in today. We're getting back to in-person Sunday school, and if you can join there, we'd surely love to have you. I really do like looking at faces in person instead of looking at my face stare back at me from this computer screen. I pray that you'll have a great week, that you'll stay safe, keep up your diligence about staying safe from COVID and trying to help everyone else stay safe. And if you can spare 2 or 3 minutes now, I hope you will enjoy a song that I've selected. Now, my Sunday school class is the senior adult group. It's the ladies group. I'm not saying that you're old, but I'm saying that you might recognize this particular song. And some of you, the ladies especially, might recognize the big hairdos and this man in black. This song just makes me smile every time I hear.
All right, here's a story about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the 4th man in the fire. Here is a story from the Bible that we know, a story about a miracle that happened long ago. Let's all have courage when temptations we meet. There's somebody watching who'll be strong when we're weak. They wouldn't bend.
They held on to the will of God, so we are told.
They wouldn't bow.
They would not bow the knees to the idols made of gold.
They wouldn't burn.
They were protected by the
4th man in the fire. They wouldn't bend. They wouldn't prophet Daniel tells about three men who walked with God, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Before the wicked king they stood. Now the king commanded them bound and thrown into the fiery coals that day. But the fire was so hot the men were slain, it forced them on their way. They wouldn't bend.
They held on to the will of God, so we are told.
They wouldn't bow.
They would not bow the knees to the idols made of gold.
They wouldn't burn.
They were protected by the
Fourth man in the fire. They wouldn't bend. They wouldn't bow. They wouldn't burn. Now when the three were cast in and the king rose up to witness their awful fate, he began to tremble at what he saw, and in astonished tones he spake. Did we not cast three men bound into the midst of the fire? I believe I see four men unhurt, unbound, and walking down there. I see Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and the fiery coals they trod. But the form of the fourth man that I see is like the Son of God. They wouldn't bend.
They held on to the will of God, so we are told.
They wouldn't bow.
They would not bow the knees to the idols made of gold.
They wouldn't burn.
They were protected by the
Fourth man in the fire. They wouldn't bend. They wouldn't bow. They wouldn't burn.
They wouldn't bend.
They held on to the will of God, so we are told.
They wouldn't bow.
They would not bow the knees to the idols made of gold.
They wouldn't bow.
They were protected by the fourth man in the fire. They wouldn't bend. They wouldn't bow. They wouldn't burn. They wouldn't bend. They wouldn't bow. They wouldn't burn.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that little song. I like all kinds of music, and I hope it blessed you in some way. Have a good week and join in again next time.